Hello everyone, this is Nori, Confessions of a Glitter Addict. This is a video tutorial to accompany the written tutorial I put up on my blog for making cake shoes. Now the idea was that I was making cake shoes for muses, but of course some of the principles here could be applied to other handmade throws, or if you wanted to make yourself a wearable pair of cake shoes, you could adapt some of the techniques shown here. As I mentioned, the step-by-step tutorial is on my blog, but we decided to make a video to go along with that because some of the steps are just easier to understand if you see them demonstrated visually. So without further ado, first up is slicing the sponge. So just a regular old cellulose kitchen sponge, you want to take a big sharp knife and very carefully cut thin slices. I like to do this by slowly working the knife through the sponge. And you can get maybe 6 slices out of a sponge this size. And every once in a while checking to make sure that I'm maintaining a nice even thickness. And then you'll have a nice even piece of sponge. So the next step after we've cut all our nice thin pieces of sponge is that we're going to glue them onto the wedge of the shoe. So you can see now I've got all my pieces of sponge and they aren't all perfect. Some are thicker, some are thinner, but it doesn't matter, you're gonna work it out. So I apply hot glue to the sole and glue the sponge onto the shoe. I do the sole first. If you're doing wearable shoes, you probably don't want to put sponge on the sole, but for muses shoes, since they're artistic displays, you can go ahead and put the cake on the bottom of the shoe. Once it's glued on, I cut it to shape so that it's fit right onto the shoe. Then I'm going to do the layers of cake on the side of the wedge. So just with a regular old hot glue gun, I put a strip on there and then I cut it so that it fits the shape of the shoe. There's going to be a little bit of a join where you add the next piece of sponge, but that's okay. It'll mostly be covered by the glitter. Don't worry about it too much. So just glue it and cut it to shape and trim it so that it fits the shoe. So that's my first layer, and now I'm doing the second layer, leaving a little bit of a gap between. On this shoe, it depends a little on the shape of the shoe, but on this shoe I'm going to put a thin stripe around the front as well, sort of continue the cake around the front. You can see that I've left a little space between the cake layers, and that's where the frosting's going to go to make it look like a nice, delicious layer cake. So the next step, once you've got the shoe all nicely covered with your sponge layers, is to glitter the sponge. Now it's tempting to go ahead and put the icing on at this point, but it's a lot easier and keeps things a lot cleaner if you glitter your sponge first. So a little something extra I've been doing on my cake shoes that is not necessary but certainly fun is to add a little fragrance. So you take the fragrance that they use for making candles and mix it into your glue. I've got some vanilla, I've got some birthday cake, mix it into the glue, and then you're ready to go. You've got glue that will scent your cake as you glitter. So as you apply the glue to the sponge, you'll probably notice that the sponge soaks up the glue a little bit more than a regular shoe would, so just make sure you add a nice even coating and keep adding more as it absorbs. You want the color of your glitter to be pretty close to the color of your sponge. You can go a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, but you want to be pretty close. So here I have some yellow sponge. I'm doing a nice bright yellow cake with Martha Stewart Lemon Drop. So I'm glittering the layers first. You can see the layers are glittered all the way around. I will come back and do the sole later, and after that's dried I'll glue that. But for now, I just wait for that to dry. So once all your cake layers have been nice and glittered and that's dry, you can move on to frosting the cake. For frosting, I'm using silicone caulk, which is super cheap and super fun and looks a lot like frosting. The only real trick to silicone caulk is getting it out of the tube. The trick to getting silicone caulk out of the tube is just that you press at the bottom, close to the bottom, just press and rotate until the cap at the bottom pops out. There it goes. And then I use a butter knife that I have claimed for crafting that is no longer food safe. And I use that to just transfer all the caulk out of the tube into paper or plastic cups. And there it is, the tube's empty, ready to go. For tinting the silicone caulk to make it look like frosting, you can use whatever paint you have in your stash. I have some regular acrylic paint, I have some fabric paint, you can use whatever. Here I'm adding a little bit of pink and then I mix it in using some chopsticks until it's nice and evenly distributed. And you can see it's pale and pretty pink like frosting. Once your frosting is tinted and ready to go, you can move it into your piping bag so that you can put it on your cake shoe. I use a Ziploc bag rather than an actual piping bag. I cut the tip off and then I put one of my frosting tips in there. I like to actually reinforce it with a little bit of tape because the caulk is so thick, it sometimes helps to have that reinforcement. So you're going to move the frosting out of the cup into the bag using that butter knife that is now just for making cake shoes. Move it little by little, and then using the knife you press it down towards the tip so it's nice and easy to pipe. And I give it a little twist and I'm ready to go. I'm ready to decorate my cake shoe. So once your bags are ready to go, you can put frosting on your glittered cake shoe. This is a different cake than the yellow cake I was working on before. This is a rainbow cake but I thought it would show nicely the piping between thin layers. So what I'm going to do is take my bag that has a thin tip because there's not a ton of space between the layers, and I'm just going to carefully pipe frosting between the layers using my pastry bag, or rather my Ziploc bag, filled with fake frosting that's been tinted pink. And you can see I'm slowly filling in between the layers, kind of letting it make a sort of messy freeform pattern. You can do pretty little patterns if you want, or you can I like it to be a little messy because then I think it looks like kind of a homemade cake. After the layers are frosted in between, I cut off the tip and then I start to spread frosting onto the shoe. You want to cover the whole shoe, every little nook and cranny. And you can do a thin layer. The shoe's a little less heavy if you do a thin layer, but I don't think it looks as much like a cake. And unlike a real cake that's going to be eaten, you aren't worried about hygiene, so you can use your fingers to spread it if you need to. So here's the cake after about 24 hours once the silicone caulk is completely dried, but make sure you give it a chance to completely dry. It can take a while since the layer is so thick. So since it's such a pale pink, what I like to do is actually mix a little bit of my regular pink glitter in with a lot of white glitter, just to make it sort of a pretty pastel. And you can blend iridescents like this. You can't really blend opaques, but the blended iridescents look really pretty and just cakey and very confectionery. So there you can see, if you compare with the original pink, it's a lot paler and matches the frosting very nicely. For the thin layers between the cake, rather than use a paintbrush, I go ahead and use one of these puff paint tubes because the nozzle's nice and thin. So I go ahead and apply that crystal clear glitter glue between the layers, and I shake on my pastel pink glitter between all the layers. Then once all those individual layers are glittered and dried, I go ahead and use my scented Mod Podge to cover the actual shoe. And I know some users use Aleene's. I would use Mod Podge because you want it to be thin, you want the texture to show through. And I would try to get it all in the first coat. I'm usually a big advocate of at least 2 coats, but if you do 1 coat, I think the underlying texture of that fake frosting shows through. And so the shoe is now completely covered with the pale pink glitter using the scented glue. So once that base frosting and the frosting between the layers is set and glittered, you can do the fun part, which is adding all the kind of pretty trims. And I'm not very good at decorating cakes, so I had a big learning curve on this, but if you're very good, then you will have a much easier time with this. But it's kind of fun to experiment, and the nice thing about the silicone is if you don't like it, you can just wipe it off and start again. So here I have a kind of pale teal frosting that's in a piping bag, and I'm just working my way around the edge of the shoe, kind of making a little border. I'm just making little, pretty rosette dollops, and you can see I'm following the lines of the shoe, but it still looks like the edging on a cake. You can also do your lettering in fake frosting so that it really looks like a cake. So here I'm writing muses in tinted silicone caulk using one of my frosting tips, and I'm doing it onto a plastic bag so that I can peel it off and pick which one I like best and then glue it to the shoe. So here I'm making some little dollops of frosting to hold my fake candles. So I'm just making little swirls of silicone caulk and then putting plastic straws in to hold the shape so that there will be a hole for my candles once the silicone caulk dries. But those are essentially all of the techniques that go into making cake shoes. So from there you can kind of experiment, play with it, mix it up and make it your own. You can decorate and embellish sort of any way you want with fake sprinkles, fake cookies, different types of fake candles. I've done a half and half chocolate lemon dough bash cake. I've done some sort of pretty pastel wedding cake style cakes, more wild, colorful birthday cakes. I've of course done a chocolate Oreo cake using brown silicone caulk as the frosting. But pretty much it's yours to play with at this point. Can't wait to see what people come up with. As always, I wish you happy glittering.